Blood pooled over the $60 million contract. Antonio De Luca pressed his gun to the Russian liaison's temple, ready to pull the trigger over a single misunderstood word. Then a soft, steady voice cut through the penthouse silence, speaking flawless Moscow dialect. The delivery woman had just saved an empire. The rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago penthouse, mirroring the storm brewing inside the sprawling, cold room. Antonio De Luca, the undisputed head of the De Luca syndicate, sat at the head of a massive obsidian table. He was a man carved from marble and violence, possessing eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the dim lighting of the room. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of a 3-year effort to unite the shipping routes of the Volkov Bratva, the Mendoza cartel, and the Corsican arms ring. It was a delicate, lethal web of global logistics, and it was currently falling apart. At Antonio's side, his translator, a sweating, pale man named Marco, stammered. Marco was a last-minute replacement. Antonio's usual linguistic liaison had been found floating in the Chicago River that morning, a clear message from an unknown rival. Marco was terrified, and his terror was breeding catastrophic mistakes. Across the table, Grigory Volkov slammed his heavy fist onto the glass, shouting a stream of harsh Russian. To his left, Mateo Mendoza stood up, his hand dropping to the silver-plated pistol tucked into his waistband, hissing venomous Spanish. In the corner, the Corsican supplier muttered angrily in rapid-fire French, signaling his bodyguards to move toward the door. Marco swallowed hard, wiping his brow. He looked at Antonio, his voice trembling. He says, "The Russian says you are a coward, boss. And the Colombian says you have broken the contract, and he will take the ports by force." Antonio did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, the movement fluid and predatory, and drew his weapon. He leveled it at Grigory's head. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, heavy with the promise of a massacre. The elevator doors at the far end of the penthouse chimed. Every gun in the room swiveled toward the sound. Stepping out of the polished steel elevator was a woman who did not belong in this world of blood and tailored suits. Beatrice Greco was drenched. Her thick, waterproof courier jacket clung to her, doing little to hide the soft, generous curves of her plus-size figure. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks, framing a face that was exhausted but undeniably striking, with full lips and intelligent, wide eyes. She was holding a waterproof lockbox containing the final authenticated port deeds necessary for the night's transaction. Beatrice froze. She was used to delivering to eccentric, wealthy clients in the dead of night, a side effect of working for the city's highest-paying, most discreet courier service. But she had never walked into a Mexican standoff. "Get out!" one of Antonio's guards barked, moving to intercept her. But Beatrice had heard the exchange. She had heard the Russian's exact words, and she had heard Marco's fatal mistranslation. She looked at the gun in Antonio's hand, then at Marco, who was practically weeping. Fear spiked through her veins, a cold thrill that told her to run, but a deeper, older instinct rooted her to the spot. If she left, people were going to die, and she would likely be shot in the back on her way down the elevator. "Wait," Beatrice said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a clear, resonant authority that momentarily baffled the armed men. She stepped forward, ignoring the guard who tried to grab her arm. She dropped the heavy lockbox onto a side table. She turned her gaze directly to Antonio De Luca. The sheer, terrifying gravity of the Mafia boss made her breath catch, but she forced her shoulders back, her plush figure straightening with quiet dignity. "Your translator is going to get you all killed," she stated in plain English. Antonio narrowed his eyes. The gun remained steady. "Who the hell are you?" "I am just a delivery woman," she said, taking another step forward into the light. "But I am also someone who knows that Mr. Volkov did not call you a coward," Marco squeaked in protest. "Boss, she doesn't know what she's talking about." "Quiet," Antonio commanded softly. The single word shut Marco down instantly. Antonio looked at Beatrice, his dark eyes sweeping over her rain-soaked form, taking in the soft curve of her hips, the fullness of her thighs beneath her damp trousers, and the fierce, unexpected fire in her gaze. "Tell me what he said." Beatrice shifted her attention to the Russian boss. She opened her mouth and spoke. The words flowed out of her in perfect, unaccented Moscow dialect. She told Grigori that the translator was incompetent and asked him to repeat his grievance. Grigori looked stunned, then barked out a laugh, responding rapidly. Beatrice turned back to Antonio. "He said that the current shipping route is a liability, not that you are a coward. He is angry because he believes the southern ports are too exposed to the feds." Before Antonio could process this, Mendoza shouted in Spanish, demanding to know what the woman was saying. Without missing a beat, Beatrice pivoted to the Colombian. She switched to flawless Bogota Spanish, soothing his ego, explaining that the Russian was concerned about federal agents, not attempting to cut the cartel out of the deal. She assured him, using the precise, formal terminology of international logistics, that the contract remained equitable. Mateo Mendoza slowly took his hand off his weapon, looking at Beatrice with newfound respect. The Corsican in the corner scoffed loudly in French, complaining that they were wasting time listening to a courier. Beatrice whipped her head toward him. In crisp, aristocratic Parisian French, she informed him that if he did not have the patience to secure a $60 million supply line, he had no business sitting at the table with men of real power. The Corsican blinked, utterly silenced. The room was completely still. Beatrice stood in the center of the deadliest men in Chicago, her chest heaving slightly beneath her damp coat. She had just seamlessly navigated a volatile diplomatic crisis in 4 languages, plus English. Antonio De Luca slowly lowered his gun. He did not look at the Russian, the Colombian, or the Corsican. His eyes were locked entirely on Beatrice Greco. The cold, empty void that usually occupied his chest was suddenly filled with a strange, dark electricity. He had spent his life surrounded by perfectly manicured, starving socialites who bored him to tears, and hardened criminals who only spoke the language of greed. Standing before him was a woman who was soft in all the places his world was hard, possessing a mind sharper than any blade in his arsenal. She was terrified. He could see the slight tremble in her hands, yet she had stared down the barrels of a dozen guns to correct a mistake. "You," Antonio said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing off the glass walls. "Come here." Beatrice hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The adrenaline that had propelled her to speak was rapidly fading, leaving behind the cold reality of her situation. She slowly walked toward the head of the table. Antonio dismissed Marco with a single flick of his wrist. "Get out of my sight before I change my mind about letting you live," he murmured. Marco scrambled for the elevator, practically sobbing in relief. Antonio gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sit down. Translate the rest of this negotiation." Flawlessly. For the next 2 hours, Beatrice Greco became the linchpin of the De Luca syndicate. She sat beside Antonio, her soft, damp clothes drying in the climate-controlled air, acting as the perfect conduit between the 3 warring factions. She didn't just translate words. She translated cultural nuances, softening insults, emphasizing compromises, and smoothing over rough edges. Every time she leaned in to whisper the English translation into Antonio's ear, he caught the scent of rain, vanilla, and something uniquely her. He found his gaze dropping to the plush curve of her lips as she spoke, the soft swell of her chest as she breathed. Antonio De Luca was a man who took what he wanted, when he wanted it. But this was a different kind of hunger. It was a sudden, violent obsession. He wanted to lock her in a vault where no one else could see her brilliance or her beauty. By 3 a.m, the contracts were signed. The foreign bosses shook Antonio's hand, offered respectful nods to Beatrice, and filed out of the penthouse, flanked by their guards. When the elevator doors closed for the final time, the massive room was left to just the two of them, overseen by Antonio's most trusted enforcers lingering in the shadows. Beatrice slowly stood up. Her legs were shaky. She picked up her courier bag. "I should go. My shift ended 4 hours ago." Antonio remained seated, steepling his fingers. He looked at her. Truly looked at her. "A woman with your intellect working as a late-night courier." "Why?" Beatrice gripped the strap of her bag. "It pays the bills. 5 languages perfectly spoken implies a level of education that does not lead to delivering lockboxes in the rain," Antonio countered, his tone dangerously soft. She looked away. "My mother had cancer. I was in a linguistics PhD program at Northwestern. The medical bills piled up. I had to drop out to take care of her, and when she passed, she left behind a mountain of debt. The courier service pays in cash, under the table, and they don't ask questions." Antonio absorbed this. A fierce loyalty to blood, a brilliant mind, and a resilience that refused to break under the weight of the world. She was magnificent. "How much debt?" he asked. Beatrice let out a tired, cynical laugh. "More than I'll make in 2 lifetimes. Goodbye, Mr. De Luca." She turned to walk away. "Lock the doors," Antonio said quietly. The heavy steel deadbolts on the penthouse doors slammed shut with a resounding clack. Beatrice spun around, panic finally breaking through her calm facade. "What are you doing? Let me out." Antonio stood and walked slowly toward her. He was a predator cornering a dove, but he moved with deliberate slowness, not wanting to frighten her into a panic, though he fully intended to cage her. He stopped inches from her. She had to tilt her head up to meet his eyes. "You are no longer a delivery woman, Beatrice Greco," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "You are going to work for me. You will be my personal translator, my advisor, and my shadow. You will be compensated generously." "I don't want to work for the Mafia," she spat, her fear manifesting as defiance. "I want to go home." Antonio reached out, his large, scarred hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. She shivered, but didn't pull away. "You don't have a choice, little bird. I need a voice I can trust. And as of right now, I have just paid off every cent of your mother's medical debt. You belong to the De Luca family now. You belong to me." Over the next 3 weeks, Beatrice's world was entirely rewritten. Antonio was as good as his word regarding the debt, wiping it out with a single phone call. But the price was her absolute freedom. She was moved into a secure suite in one of Antonio's luxury hotels. Her closet was filled with exquisite, custom-tailored designer clothing that hugged every curve of her plus-size figure, fabrics of silk and cashmere that made her feel beautiful, yet entirely bought. She was by his side at every meeting, every dinner, every tense negotiation. She learned the rhythms of the underworld. She also learned the terrifying depths of Antonio's protectiveness. It happened at a private underground casino gathering run by the syndicate. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive bourbon. Beatrice was wearing a deep emerald gown that accentuated her full hips and cleavage, standing closely behind Antonio as he played cards. A lower-level capo from a neighboring territory, a man who had had too much to drink, leaned over the table. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes tracing her figure with blatant disrespect. "De Luca," the capo slurred, laughing. "I see you got a new pet. Must cost a fortune to feed her. She's a bit heavy for a man of your tastes, isn't she? Lots of extra padding there." Beatrice felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She looked down, her old insecurities screaming in her ears. Antonio did not blink. He didn't even drop his cards. In one fluid, blindingly fast motion, he grabbed the heavy, solid crystal ashtray from the center of the table and brought it crashing down directly into the center of the capo's face. The sound of shattering bone echoed like a gunshot over the casino floor. Blood sprayed across the green felt. The capo collapsed backward, screaming in agony, his jaw entirely broken. The music stopped. The casino went dead silent. Antonio's enforcers drew their weapons, but no one dared move. Antonio slowly wiped a drop of blood from his cufflink. He stood up, towering over the writhing man on the floor. "The next time a man speaks about my woman with anything less than absolute reverence," Antonio said, his voice cold enough to freeze the room, "I will cut out his tongue and feed it to the dogs. Take this trash out of my sight. My woman." The words rang in Beatrice's ears. He had never claimed her so publicly, so fiercely. When Antonio turned back to her, his eyes were burning with a dark, possessive froid. He reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek, his touch impossibly tender compared to the violence he had just unleashed. However, Antonio's violent declaration did not go unnoticed. Across the room, sipping champagne from a crystal flute, stood Cordelia Dunmore. Cordelia was the heir to a massive, corrupt British-American shipping fortune. She was razor-thin, with sharp, aristocratic features and eyes the color of winter ice. For years, she had been positioning herself to become Antonio De Luca's wife, a strategic marriage that would merge her family's failing legal empire with his booming illegal one. She had the pedigree, the ruthlessness, and the connections. And now, she watched as the most dangerous man in Chicago risked a syndicate war over an insult directed at a chubby, unknown translator. Cordelia's manicured fingers tightened around the stem of her glass until her knuckles turned white. She stared at Beatrice, taking in the soft curves and the terrified but beautiful face. A cold, venomous hatred bloomed in Cordelia's chest. She handed her glass to a waiter and turned to her head of security. "Find out everything there is to know about that fat cow," Cordelia whispered, a cruel smile touching her thin lips. "And then find out how to break her. No one stands in my way. No one." Autumn bled into winter, blanketing Chicago in freezing rain and bitter winds. Inside the impenetrable walls of the De Luca syndicate, the temperature was a different kind of extreme. Beatrice Greco had ceased being merely a prisoner of circumstance. She had become the undisputed queen of Antonio's dark empire, even if the crown was unspoken. Her days were spent in high-level strategy meetings. Beatrice's linguistic brilliance extended far beyond translation. She possessed an analytical mind that could decipher complex supply chain discrepancies hidden within foreign ledgers. She saved Antonio millions by catching a skimming operation run by a rogue captain in Palermo, reading the Sicilian dialect coded within the financial reports that his top accountants had missed. With every passing week, Antonio's obsession deepened into a fierce, all-consuming devotion. He treated her not as an employee or a captive, but as a goddess. The insecurity Beatrice had harbored her entire life regarding her plus-size figure evaporated under his intense, worshipful gaze. Antonio despised the frail, starving socialites of his past. He loved the soft, plush weight of Beatrice's hips under his hands, the generous curve of her thighs, and the radiant, healthy flush of her cheeks. He hired a private chef from Rome solely to prepare elaborate, decadent meals for her, watching with a predator's satisfaction as she learned to embrace pleasure without guilt. "You are a feast in a world of famine, little bird," he murmured one evening, his large hands tracing the soft swell of her stomach as she stood before a mirror in a custom-made crimson silk dress. "You are exactly as you were meant to be. Mine." But outside their fortified penthouse, a venomous threat was coiled and ready to strike. Cordelia Dunmore had spent the last 2 months meticulously gathering intelligence. Her spies within the city's underbelly reported Beatrice's rising influence, fueling Cordelia's rage. To Cordelia, Beatrice was a fat, uncultured peasant who had stolen the most powerful man in the Midwest. The Dunmore shipping empire was bleeding money, drowning in federal fines, and the alliance with the DeLuca syndicate was Cordelia's only lifeline. She needed Antonio, and she needed Beatrice eradicated. The opportunity arose during the annual Midwest Logistics and Trade Gala, hosted at the sprawling, isolated Dunmore family estate in Lake Forest, Illinois. The gala was a front, a gathering of the region's elite corporate titans and underworld bosses masquerading as philanthropists. Neutral ground. Antonio had not wanted to bring Beatrice, his protective instincts warring with the necessity of her presence to negotiate with a group of visiting Swiss financiers. Beatrice, wearing a stunning midnight blue velvet gown that accentuated her full curves, assured him she would be fine. The Dunmore mansion was a cavernous Gothic structure of dark stone and polished oak. The ballroom was packed with ruthless men and glittering women. The air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and dangerous ambition. Halfway through the evening, the Swiss delegation requested a private meeting with Antonio in the estate's cigar room, explicitly stating that only the principals were permitted. Antonio's jaw tightened. He signaled his 2 best enforcers to flank Beatrice near the ballroom's grand fireplace. "Do not move from this spot," Antonio ordered quietly, his hand lingering on the bare skin of her shoulder. "I will be back in 10 minutes. As soon as Antonio disappeared down the mahogany corridor, Cordelia made her move. She glided across the ballroom, her razor-thin frame draped in silver, looking like a blade of ice. She approached Beatrice with a sickly sweet smile, trailed by 4 massive security contractors. "Miss Greco," Cordelia purred, her British accent clipping the consonants. "Or should I say, the delivery girl?" "I must admit, I am shocked Antonio dresses you up and parades you around. It is like putting a silk saddle on a sow." Beatrice felt the sting of the insult, the old, familiar ghost of humiliation tapping at her shoulder. But she remembered Antonio's hands, his reverence, and the undeniable power she now wielded. She stood tall, refusing to shrink. "Miss Dunmore," Beatrice replied smoothly, her voice calm and steady. "I suppose when one's family empire is collapsing under the weight of its own incompetence, one has to resort to petty insults at parties." "Excuse me." Cordelia's eyes flashed with pure, unadulterated hatred. The aristocratic mask slipped. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted at the far end of the ballroom. A fight broke out between 2 rival cartel members, drawing the attention of the entire room, including Antonio's enforcers, who instinctively stepped forward to assess the threat. It was a perfectly timed distraction. Cordelia nodded to her contractors. Before Beatrice could scream, a heavy, chemically soaked cloth was pressed hard over her nose and mouth. Strong arms dragged her backward into a concealed servants' corridor, hidden behind a tapestry. The ballroom music faded into a muffled hum as darkness swallowed Beatrice whole. Beatrice awoke to the smell of rust, damp earth, and freezing cold. Her head throbbed violently. She was tied to a heavy steel chair in what looked like an abandoned subterranean wine cellar, the stone walls dripping with condensation. Only a single harsh work lamp illuminated the space. Standing before her was Cordelia, smoking a long, thin cigarette. Behind the British heiress stood 3 heavily armed mercenaries. "Ah, the pig is awake," Cordelia sneered, exhaling a cloud of grey smoke. "Do you know why you are here, Beatrice? You are going to suffer a tragic, fatal accident at the hands of unknown assailants. Antonio will be devastated, of course, but he is a pragmatist. When my family offers him a merged security force to hunt down your killers, he will have no choice but to wed me to solidify the treaty." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind, forged under pressure and fine-tuned by the underworld, immediately began to race. She did not cry. She did not beg. She looked past Cordelia to the mercenaries. They were talking in low, hushed tones, ignoring the 2 women. They were speaking Ukrainian. Beatrice focused on their words. "Did you set the charges?" the first mercenary asked his companion. "Yes," the second replied. "The entire north corridor is wired with C4. As soon as De Luca breaches the cellar doors, we blow the tunnel. He and his men will be buried under 50 tons of stone. Then we take our payment from the British bitch and leave her here to rot." Beatrice's blood ran cold. This was not just an assassination plot against her. It was a trap to slaughter Antonio. Upstairs in the mansion, hell had broken loose. Antonio had returned to the fireplace to find Beatrice gone. When his enforcers told him about the distraction and her subsequent vanishing, a terrifying, unnatural silence had fallen over him. He did not yell. He did not panic. He simply drew his weapon and began systematically executing Cordelia's guards in the center of the ballroom, until one of them, bleeding from a shattered kneecap, pointed toward the hidden servants' door. Antonio De Luca descended into the bowels of the estate like a reaper of souls. He moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency, his men clearing the corridors behind him. He left a trail of broken bodies in his wake. No locked door, no armed guard could stop the violent force of a man who had finally found the one thing in the world he loved, only to have it stolen. Down in the cellar, the heavy metal door at the end of the tunnel groaned loudly. "He is here," Cordelia whispered, a triumphant, psychotic smile spreading across her face. "Goodbye, Beatrice." The mercenaries raised their weapons, the leader holding a remote detonator in his left hand, ready to press the button the second the cellar door swung open. Beatrice knew she had seconds. She twisted her wrists violently against the rough rope. The friction burned her skin to a bloody pulp, but she managed to slip her right hand free just enough to grab the heavy metal wine rack beside her chair. With a ferocious surge of strength, fueled by pure adrenaline and love, she tipped the massive rack over. The crash of glass and metal distracted the mercenaries for a fraction of a second. The cellar doors exploded inward, kicked off their hinges by Antonio. "Antonio, no. The floor is wired. Shoot the man on the left." Beatrice screamed at the top of her lungs, roaring the warning in flawless Ukrainian, knowing it was the only language the mercenaries would instinctively process as a threat, causing them to hesitate and look at each other in shock. That microsecond of confusion was all Antonio needed. Processing her warning instantly, Antonio did not step into the room. From the threshold, his gun barked 3 times in rapid succession. The mercenary holding the detonator took a bullet directly between the eyes before his thumb could depress the switch. The other 2 mercenaries were cut down by Antonio's enforcers a heartbeat later. Cordelia shrieked, dropping her cigarette, pulling a small silver pistol from her clutch. She aimed it wildly at Beatrice. "If I cannot have him, neither can you." Before Cordelia could pull the trigger, Antonio crossed the room with terrifying speed. He did not shoot her. He grabbed her wrist, snapping it backward with a sickening crack. Cordelia screamed, dropping the gun. Antonio drove his fist into her face, shattering her aristocratic cheekbones, sending her sprawling unconscious to the cold stone floor. The silence that followed was broken only by Beatrice's ragged breathing. Antonio dropped his weapon and fell to his knees beside her. His hands, usually so steady, were trembling as he untied the ropes binding her. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of her like a drowning man finding air. "I have you," he choked out, his voice thick with an emotion no one in the syndicate had ever heard from him. "I have you, my queen. I am so sorry." Beatrice wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, holding him just as tightly, burying her face into the collar of his ruined tuxedo. "I am okay, Antonio. I am right here." He pulled back, cupping her face, his dark eyes tracing every detail of her features, to assure himself she was alive. He saw the blood on her wrists, and a murderous darkness passed over his expression. But he suppressed it for her. He stood up, lifting her into his arms as effortlessly as if she weighed nothing at all. Her soft curves pressed against his hard armor, fitting together like 2 halves of a whole. "Burn this estate to the ground," Antonio ordered his men, not even looking back at the unconscious body of Cordelia Dunmore or the dead mercenaries. "Burn it all." He carried Beatrice up the stairs and out into the freezing Chicago night, shielding her from the wind with his coat. As they drove away in his armored SUV, the Dunmore mansion erupted in a massive pillar of fire, painting the winter sky in shades of violent orange and red. Beatrice rested her head against Antonio's chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. She had walked into a room of killers as a terrified delivery woman, crushed by debt and the weight of the world's harsh judgments. Now, she was the undisputed matriarch of the most feared empire in the country, loved completely and fiercely by a monster who would burn the world down to keep her warm. She looked up at him, the glow of the fire reflecting in her eyes. "I love you," she whispered. Antonio tightened his grip on her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And I worship you, Beatrice, today, tomorrow, and until my last breath." The Mafia boss had lost his translator, but he had found his soul. If you loved this gripping, high-stakes Mafia romance, do not forget to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love dark romance, unexpected twists, and fierce heroines who know their worth. Drop a comment below to let us know which language Beatrice Uwok was your favorite, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, gritty underworld tales delivered right to your feed. See you in the next video.